poor people stay poor people, and they never get to see. Someone's got to win in the human race. If it isn't.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to DiEM25's Another Now. The program that was made possible is coming to you due to a mindless virus that has put capitalism in suspended animation. Has not ended capitalism, just made it more brutal and more horrific for the weak, for those who are always exposed to the crisis of capitalism. But it is a unique crisis because, come to think of it, never before has capitalism just paused. The Second World War had no such effect. If anything, the factories were humming away faster than ever. Capital was accumulating faster than ever. The same applied to all wars. This is a unique moment, but it's also a unique moment because it allows us to envision an alternative now. This is why we call this program Another Now. Arundhati Roy put it beautifully in, of all places, the Financial Times, when she said that this silly virus is providing us with a portal. We can enter that portal and come on the other side, either carrying with us the dead carcasses of dead ideas and a destroyed environment, or we can travel lightly and reimagine the world differently. Of course, there's no guarantee whatsoever that the world is going to become a better place because of this crisis. Like no crisis in the past has guaranteed any sort of improvement, but we have an opportunity. And we have wonderful guests in DiEM25's Another Now. Today we have not just an important politician, but also a friend and a personal comrade, somebody that we campaigned together during 2016 against Brexit across Britain. We set up DiEM25 together in Berlin in 2016 again. Since then, our paths have crossed many times. We have our agreements, some disagreements, but more than anything, we have a common project to create problems for those who want this planet to become brown and the people living on it to be more divided than ever. I have the great joy and pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Caroline Lucas, the only Green Member of Parliament. Caroline, welcome to DiEM25's Another Now.
Well, thank you so much, Yanis. It's a real pleasure to see you, to imagine you, I guess, still on your Greek island, and yeah, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Caroline, I often think of you when I'm in Parliament, because the life of a progressive parliamentarian in the minority of the opposition is never easy. We have a very hard time these days with the combination of authoritarianism and ultra-right-wing policies that are being affected. But at least, even though Mela25, our party in Parliament, is small, I have 8 colleagues. You, on the other hand, are all alone in this sea of MPs. What? How many of you are there? 650, right?
Yeah.
And you're the only member of Parliament representing the Green Party. The loneliness must be devastating.
Well, I'm grateful for your recognition of that in a way, and to have 7 colleagues, to be a group of 8 or 9 would just be miraculous as far as I'm concerned. So I look over to you quite enviously, and I am blessed by my incredible team around me, the people that work with me. Some of them have been with me right from the start, some of them actually even from my days as a member of the European Parliament. So I feel very blessed in them. But it is true that as the only representative of my party, I do feel a particular responsibility and burden, in a sense of, I mean, it's a privilege, of course, but I say burden because there is just so much to do. There are so many battles to fight, so many fires to try to put out, so many ideas to try to bring forward. And as just one person, it is just so deeply frustrating not to be able to kind of scale up that impact. And of course, at root of this, as you know, is the horrible electoral system that we have in this country, in the UK. In 2015, over 1 million people voted Green. and still just one MP, you know, and it's not just me making a special pleading as a small party thinking we should have more MPs, although that's true, but there are real costs to this electoral system in terms of, I think, people's alienation from it, their sense that whatever they vote, they never actually see the person they vote for get represented, so people get more disenchanted, disengaged from our political system, and it's just simply dysfunctional, I think. So alongside many other economic and environmental campaigns, certainly parliamentary reform and political reform is high on my agenda.
As you know, I remain very close to Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, but I never withheld my intense criticism, even of those comrades of mine, for not making electoral reform part of the Labour Party, the Corbyn Labour Party agenda. I understand where they were coming from, because if you were leader of the Labour Party, not that you would ever want to be, but if you were leader of the Labour Party, you'd face this terrible backlash from the internal opposition, because the moment you said, let's go proportional, let's adopt proportional representation, the accusation will be hurled immediately at you that, that means that you do not believe you can win a majority. This is why so this instrumental thinking about politics, where the ends justify the means and the electoral system is just another instrument. This is, you know, such a major blow to democracy.
Well, it is, and I think it's so short-sighted too, because you're quite right. I'm sure that would have been the criticism that would have been levelled at Jeremy and John had they done that. But also just looking at the electoral maths, they would also know that, frankly, on their own, they were not going to win. It would have taken an absolute revolution for them to have won in the last election, or even the one before that. So when it's in their own political interests, as well as being the right thing to do, that is why I'm less forgiving than you are, because there's plenty of evidence out there to suggest that if they would have made the case, and there is a perfectly valid case to be made, to say that the challenges that we face in the world today are such that we should make common cause with people around the issues that we agree with them on, that no single political party has a monopoly on wisdom. And maybe, just maybe, if we work together in a more transparent and cooperative way, we might just be able to harness the best parts of all of the traditions that our different political parties bring to the table. So I think they could have made, you know, a strong, substantial case about the benefits to politics of doing this, as well as actually an instrumental case, which is that they would have had a much better chance of getting a coalition of the left in power had they changed the electoral system, or at least campaigned to change the electoral system, than by pretending, frankly, that they could win going it alone, because people knew that they couldn't.
Well, I always believe that one should do the right thing just for the hell of it, and then good byproducts come to you. So I was always very anti-instrumentalist, very much against instrumental thinking. But look, Caroline, in Another Now, we try to move away from the standard conversations that one hears on television and radio. So why don't we go back to the very beginning, the 1960s?
Wow.
More or less of the same age. I think we are of the same age.
Yeah,
we're not going to tell anyone how old we are. What were your early influences, culturally, politically, discursively, family, friends? You know, what made you, start becoming Caroline?
Wow. So I grew up in a small town in England called Malvern, and my parents were kind of small C conservatives. There was never any political discussion at home. There were hardly any books at home. In some sense, although they were kind parents and wanted the best for me, it always felt like we were slightly on different planets. And then I met a friend at school who changed my life when I was about 12 or 13. And this friend at school came from a very, very different background. Her house was full of books. Her mother couldn't cook in the kitchen without having a book. I remember watching her. She had a, Jane Austen or something in one hand, as she had the kind of baking bowl in the other. She was just immersed in literature. And this was just the most wonderful, eye-opening thing for me. And so literature was my first love, actually. I studied literature at university. I remember at school we had music lessons, but I was never very good at playing the violin. I would never subject anyone to listening to me playing the violin. But what my friend Rachel and I used to do was to skive off to one of the little music rooms, which was a long way away from the teachers, and just read poetry. So she would bring Emily Dickinson to me and read Emily Dickinson, who I'd never heard of before. You know, we would just have a most extraordinary time. And then her mother said, would you like to come to Paris for a weekend? Which is like, my God, I had never been to Paris. So we went to Paris, and she took us to the Rodin Museum. She read the poems of Jacques Prévert. We stood on the bridge where Alain Fournier had seen the girl that produced the inspiration for Le Grand Môle, the famous book that he wrote. So I guess, yeah, I felt that I had a portal through this friend into another world. So my first love was literature. And then after that, I suppose I'm fast forwarding quite a bit, but after that, I was involved at university in the women's movement, in the environmental movement, in the anti-nuclear movement. Mostly into the anti-nuclear movement, actually. I never stayed at DiEM25, but I visited there often. And I was finding myself being very dispersed in all these different campaigns that I was trying to be involved in. And then I read a book that changed my life. And this book was by Jonathan Porritt, called Seeing Green. And basically what that book did, and I think he wrote it in around 86, maybe 84. But what the book did was to make all the connections between the different things I was concerned about: the environment, the women's movement, anti-nuclear. And he connected them into a kind of political ideology that made the links between them and demonstrated that our system of capitalism was such that was leading to many of these outcomes that I was busy firefighting around. And it was such a relief to realize that actually, instead of having to be at a different meeting every night of the week, I could just go to the Green Party meetings, and kind of that would do the whole job. So I remember actually when I first read that book, I was living in a rather unpleasant bedsit in Clapham. And I finished the book, and on the back of the book, it said the Green Party, or in fact the Ecology Party as it was then, was based in the Clapham High Road. And there I was living in Clapham. So I just thought, my God, this is meant to be. So I marched up and down the Clapham High Road there and then, looking for what I imagined would be a big building with a gold plaque on the door saying Green Party. And of course, eventually I found a tiny broom cupboard behind a Chinese restaurant, which was in fact the offices of the Green Party. But I joined up there and then and got involved with the party from there.
Well, let me take you 1 or 2 years.
Yeah,
before.
sorry, that was...
No, connected. I also spent time at DiEM25, and I was also engaged almost fully with the miners' strike in 1984, and later on at Wapping and all that. I wanted to ask you about the miners' strike, because that was, you just couldn't escape it. It was such a majestic clash between different powerful forces. And also a pretty tragic dispute, in the sense that on the one hand, we were defending communities that needed and deserved defending. On the other hand, we were defending an industry that did not deserve defending. So how did you experience, that was before you read that pivotal book. You had not become a member of the Green Party yet. What was, I remember the pain I used to feel in 1984. Every day, you know, the attacks by the media on the integrity of the miners who were striking against picket lines, the right to work, you know, the Nottinghamshire miners versus the Yorkshire miners. How did you experience this as I suspect you already had, you know, a green propensity, while at the same time you were involved in that, you know, you were a material witness to this major clash between the Mine Workers Union and the Thatcher government. Tell me about it.
Well, I experienced it almost as two parallel worlds, because I was at home quite a lot at that time with my parents still staying there, and they read the Daily Mail. And for anybody who doesn't know about the Daily Mail, it is a horrible right-wing rag, and they had the most awful coverage of the miners. You know, they absolutely vilified Arthur Scargill, the leaders of the miners' union. You know, they would make it sound as if the miners were these completely uncontrolled, raging, violent, you know, people to be absolutely condemned. So they had the Daily Mail at home, and I bought the Guardian. and trying to reconcile on the same day the stories in both papers was just quite a mind-blowing experience, because it was quite clearly that there were just two utterly opposing narratives around that. And so I suppose what I was quite interested in at the time, as well as you say, the brutality, and then you saw it on your TV screen every night, the brutality of the way in which the miners were treated, and the sense of how on earth are the police, are the powers that be getting away with doing that. But at the same time, there were just so many different stories around the same events, and just trying to understand how they could be true. To be honest, at the time, I was thinking much less about the environmental impacts of coal mining. That was less in my mind than just trying to understand how one country, how the same country could be experiencing the same event in at least two, and actually a myriad, utterly different and contradictory ways. And it was one of the first times of really trying to understand how decent people, my parents were very decent people, but how they read this newspaper and believed it, and how they held that set of beliefs at the same time as I was reading my newspaper and my sense of what was happening, which was 100% opposite.
Let's say that we were to enter a time machine and go back to the beginning of 1984. Now that you have, and I have, we all have this environmental consciousness, how do you go about, supporting these communities that dependent on the worst fuel in the world, the fuel that damages the world the most? It's one thing for us to say, oh, but we believe in supporting you in the context of the green transition, to go from what generations of you did to renewables. But it's not clear that this transition would replace jobs in the villages in Yorkshire and Kent and in Scotland and so on, where the mining communities were so strong and actually had built up both a power base and an economic existence out of that awful coal. How do you, because as you can imagine now, there are similar discussions happening in Poland with lignite. Here in Greece, there are, in the middle of a devastated country, absolutely devastated country. And with this coronavirus situation now, we have a very small number of deaths from coronavirus, but we are certainly in this country going to have the largest percentage of people who go hungry as a result of the economic depression. So there are two towns that depend on lignite. And I have to tell you that as a party leader, it's very difficult to even believe the narrative of my own party when we say to them that we'll bring renewables and we will bring the green transition and there will be jobs, because it's not clear that the jobs will necessarily, of course there will be jobs, and maybe a lot more jobs, definitely more jobs in the new green energy industry than now, but not necessarily in those towns. So how imagine this time machine, you go back there, what do you say to them?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in a sense, you don't even need to imagine the time machine, in the sense that it's a very live discussion right now in many places and in different industries. I think what makes it even more complicated when we take the time machine and look at the mining communities in particular is that mining was much more than a job. I mean, it defined whole communities in terms of their sense of their self, their pride. In many ways it was a horrible job, and it led to many early deaths. But it was also something that people did feel an identity through and a pride through, and that's who their community is and was. And so I think it makes it even more complicated than perhaps looking at an industry right now. One of the ones that the big debate is here in the UK right now is around the aviation industry and what's going to happen to all of the aviation workers when flights don't return. And we know that aviation is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So the debate is going on again now, but I take the point, I think, that back in, back at the time of the miners' strike, it was hitting right at the heart of communities so much more deeply, because it was going right to the heart of their identities. And I don't have a simple answer for you, except to say that I think the answer would have to come from the communities themselves, in the sense that one of the things that you will know about too, but one of the things I find most inspiring, although it didn't actually translate into a new set of jobs, but the Lucas factory the aerospace factory. There's a very famous case study going back right into the 70s of a factory that was going to close, and the workers came together and said, hang on a minute, let's see what we can do using our skills to see if we could redeploy them, and with some training, what could we actually do? And there's a whole, you know, a whole literature about how these workers came up with proposals. I think a lot of their suggestions were around that skills could be used to be making equipment, prosthetic equipment for people with disabilities. So it literally was a kind of weapons into plowshares type analogy. But the bottom line was, it was the workers themselves coming together. And I can't say, sitting here in Brighton, that I would know how I could help transform a mining community in Durham. But I hope I would have the wit and wisdom to say, I think you people in Durham are the ones that we need to listen to on this, and we need to support. And it'll take money. It won't be a cheap thing, you know, because people are going to resist any kind of change if they think that their incomes are going to be affected by it, if their ability to put food on the table for their families are going to be affected by it. So the bottom line, first of all, has to be some kind of income guarantees to give people even the space to imagine something different. But it feels to me that the question that you have asked is the most important question, in a sense, because many Greens, myself included, you know, talk sometimes very glibly about the just transition, about the fact that there are far more jobs in a green economy than in the fossil fuel economy that it replaces. And although I passionately believe that's true, it is of absolutely no reassurance to someone right now who is in a high carbon industry, who wants to know what they're going to be doing in a year's time, what their family is going to be doing, what jobs their kids are going to be doing. It's got to have flesh and blood. You've got to be able to touch it and smell it and really believe it. And that won't happen unless we put in place some kinds of deliberative processes that are supported and mediated and facilitated and financed, to try to see how we work through this, how those skills can change. Because the bottom line is, however much those jobs are so important to the people that have them, if they are killing the planet that we are living on, then there will be no future for those people and their families into the future in any case. And this is a matter of life and death. That can sometimes sound very overdramatic, but when we're talking about the climate threat, it is not being overdramatic, it is happening now. So I think we have to start from the recognition that there is an imperative to change, but how you change has got to be driven by the people who are most impacted by it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thinking of the miners' strike, it just occurred to me to ask you, and just point blank say no. Is it not the case that during our lifetimes, at least political lifetimes, in the United Kingdom in particular, the two truly divisive clashes were, one, the miners' strike, and the second, Brexit?
I think I'm going to say yes. I think that is absolutely right. I mean, there were things along the way. The Iraq War was pretty divisive, although I guess as time went on, more, you know, the number of people in favor of the Iraq War was getting smaller and smaller. So I guess it wasn't quite such a strong divide in the country. So yeah, I think I would accept your proposition there.
How do you feel now about this whole Brexit business? Because let's face it, it's more or less got settled by the tremendous success of the Brexiteers, of Boris Johnson's December general election victory. It seems to me now that this coronavirus story, allow me to give you my prediction, is going to create circumstances for a rupture at the end of the year. I don't think there is going to be an extension of the transition period. I think Boris Johnson is going to take advantage of this situation to say, well, what do you mean a disruption in supply chains? They've already been ruptured. The European Union is losing the plot on the other side of the pond. Already the single market that was the main reason for continuing, for maybe giving an extension to the agreement, is already crumbling within the continent of Europe. With you can see the way in which Germany and Italy are being pulled apart. The German state has the capacity effectively to fund German businesses, whereas the Italian state doesn't. So we're not even talking about the single market anymore. All this is working towards a hard Brexit. Look back to the last 4 or 5 years. We worked together for this for some time. We had a disagreement on the second referendum. But in any way, we are once again, we are part of the losing side of history. So reassess the last 4 years.
Well, I want to challenge you first of all. I think it's too soon to say we're on the losing side of history. Let's just see, history takes longer to play out than you sometimes think.
We always fall back to that.
So let's just wait. But I mean, I feel, what do I feel? I feel heartbroken by it still. It doesn't feel like it is all over and finished, because the very same people who were at the heart of the Vote Leave campaign are now in Downing Street. Dominic Cummings, the advisor to Boris Johnson, was absolutely instrumental in the Brexit process. And I think people's minds are very much concerned about, are we really going to deliver yet another shock to our threadbare economy by having a hard Brexit at the end of this year? Is it really going to be the case that the Prime Minister will bluff this out and say, yes, there can't possibly be an extension? And you're probably right. Perhaps he probably will go and do that, and then the impacts on an economy that will be on its knees from COVID will just get an absolute second wave of damage done to it. I mean, looking back on those years, what could we have done differently? I mean, personally, I think my biggest political mistake was to have supported the idea of a referendum in the first place. I voted for a referendum because I had been a member of the European Parliament for 10 years. And in my experience in the European institutions, it felt to me that people who said, I was never consulted about the way the EU is going, I want to be part of this conversation, I thought they had a strong point. And I thought, naively, stupidly in retrospect, I thought it would be possible to have a debate about the purpose and the direction of the European Union, about why it mattered, about how we could together help to influence it and to give a stronger focus on the social and then the environmental side of the EU rather than the economic side of it. I had believed back in 2008 and 9 that might be possible, and I was proved to be spectacularly wrong. So I feel a level of complicity in the disaster that's happened in a way. I wish things had been done differently. It's really clear that the referendum on the terms that were set out should never have been allowed to happen like that. When you look at countries that are more used to referenda than we are, like Ireland, then they would have had so much deliberation before they ever got to the actual referendum campaign, through citizens' assemblies, through deliberative democracy, through things like having a threshold. So you wouldn't just have had a 48-52, you would have built in some kind of threshold, perhaps that either side, the winning side, would have to meet before actually triggering what happened. There is so much that we can think back on with the benefit of hindsight in terms of the process that led to the referendum and its result. I think the media have a really strong part to have played in it, and the right-wing media in particular. That Boris Johnson, again, there he was as a journalist in Brussels, spilling out these lies about the EU, which were never really challenged. And so by the time we got to the referendum, people really did think that commissioners spent their time deciding whether or not bendy bananas should be allowed in the single market or not. They really did think that this was a massively expensive bureaucracy, whereas in fact, there were fewer people working for the European Commission than there were for one of our own city councils here in the UK. So yeah, we can learn a lot from what led up to that referendum. I feel angry that Labour didn't campaign more strongly to remain. I think if they were serious about being for the many, not the few, then that would have made it incumbent upon them to have taken a much stronger position in the referendum. And I think if they had, I'm sure if they had, we could have won the referendum. As it is, although it's true that in these dark days of COVID, you know, debates about Brexit seem like another world, I don't think that division has gone away. I think it's still very present in society.
I remember back in the day when we were campaigning against Brexit, my feeling was every time I heard David Cameron, George Osborne, Tony Blair speak out in favor of Remain, I thought, oh my God.
No, shut up.
We just lost, shut up. When I heard Christine Lagarde threaten the people of Britain with Armageddon if they dare vote Brexit, or Wolfgang Schäuble for that matter. So all the lies coming out of the Treasury, those ridiculous prognostications of a complete economic catastrophe, you know, even down to decimal points, that Britain will lose 21.36% of GDP, which, you know, this is, you know, just made up pseudo statistics. For me, it wasn't Jeremy's tepid defense of Remain. For me, what really lost the vote for us was our friends, you know, the radical center and its support of the EU, and the uncritical support, presenting the EU as the best thing since sliced bread. No nuanced critique of the European Union. David Cameron's only critique was that it didn't allow that the European Union did not allow him to curtail freedom of movement, which was a great thing that it did not allow him to curtail freedom of movement. That was not the problem. There was never any criticism of the lack of democracy in Brussels, of what it was doing with the Troika in Greece, in Italy, in Spain, and so on and so forth. But let me share a thought with you that has been hitting me now for about a year. I want your opinion on it. Looking at the long term, since 1991 with the Maastricht Treaty, you know, Thatcher made a very big mistake in her assessment of the euro and the Maastricht Treaty. She thought it was federation through the back door, remember? It wasn't. And proof of it is now that when we really should federate in Europe in order to survive, we're still not doing it, and we are nowhere near it. We are further away from it than ever. So in 1991, when they created the euro, and let's not get into the reasons why they did, but the moment you create a common currency, effectively you put this European Union on a rail track that leads inexorably to a junction. The junction is going to be arrived at the moment you have the first monetary crisis, and either you federate or you disintegrate. By refusing to federate constantly since 2010, we have, in my view, you know, a train wreck in slow motion. Now, given that, is there not, this is me playing a devil's advocate, is there not an argument to those soft Brexiteers, you know, people like Evans Pritchard, the economic editor of The Telegraph, who was in favor of remaining until 2 weeks before the referendum, who said, look, this European Union is not moving in a rational direction. It's going to create its own self-inflicted damage and crisis. Maybe we should get out. How do you respond to that? To a soft, you know, quasi-Remain position that in the end says there was a logic to Brexit behind the, you know, the Dominic Cummings toxicity and all that.
I'm just trying to think the best way to try to answer your question, because yeah, the Green Party always felt that the euro, the single currency, was exactly the wrong policy, that it would imply common interest rates, it would imply, yeah, that the federal structure that you're talking about, if it was going to survive, and we knew that the countries weren't going to support that, and so then the opposite becomes disintegration. So I take the logic of what you're saying on that. But at the same time, I guess I would say that the policies of the EU are the sum total of the member states who sit around the table at that time, the leaders of those countries at that time. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to confuse an opposition to the policies of a majority of the member states around the table at any given time, and then to suggest that the institution itself is therefore not worthy or useful or effective. And there are plenty of things that the EU did and does that I strongly oppose, and the way in which, you know, Greece in particular was treated through the financial crisis is an object lesson in that. But even you at that time were not arguing to leave the EU when you would have had such good reason to, in the sense of the way in which Greece was treated. Because I guess, and obviously I'll let you speak for yourself, but for me it still feels that the institution of countries coming together to try to work through these challenges at a time when challenges such as these cannot be dealt with at a member state level effectively, so many of them cannot, then we were going to need that level of debate and some of those structures, even if we don't like the way in which the current leadership of a majority of countries at a particular time are using them. I would rather we did what we tried to do with DiEM and that famous meeting in Berlin in 2016 to try to bring together progressive forces across Europe and say loudly and clearly that another Europe is possible. I feel that by, you know, pulling the plug, we've let the baby out with the bathwater, and we're left with chaos, frankly.
Absolutely, and I don't regret it for a moment. And this is still our position as DiEM25, and we're still fighting the good fight to transform, not to reform. I don't believe that
No.
reform, but it can be. Look, the main reason why I would never regret sticking to the idea of transnational Europeanism is this. One feeling, when I am in Hamburg, in Hanover, in Berlin, as a Greek politician, as a Greek citizen, and I address an audience of progressives, you know, lefties, greenies, feminists, our comrades in Germany. I know that if I were to say to them, look, I've given up on the EU because, you know, it sucks. And I believe that my country should, you know, we should leave the EU because of all the damage that it has undoubtedly inflicted upon my people. The moment I say that, you know what's going to happen? The good people in there are going to be devastated. You know what they will think? Our German comrades, oh my God, we are all alone against Volkswagen, Siemens, Deutsche Bank, and the oligarchy here. I don't feel I have the moral right to abandon them in that way, because, you know, being a progressive in the heart of the beast is not easy if you are left alone. And, you know, this idea that is now becoming prevalent, especially after the maltreatment of Italy and Spain during the coronavirus outbreak and economic depression by, you know, the German finance minister, the Dutch finance minister, you know, the usual suspects. There is this tendency now to talk about, you know, maybe the European South should secede and create its own union. I say, no. I prefer the parasitic oligarchy of Germany to the parasitic oligarchy of Greece. You know, they're actually nicer people than the Greek oligarchs, and nicer people than the Italian oligarchs. I don't want a union of Greek and Italian and Spanish oligarchs. I prefer to have a common movement like DiEM25 of progressives struggling against all the oligarchs together across Europe. So I think we are as one on this. But let's move it beyond that, because, okay, I believe that Brexit is done now. Unlike you, I think it's done.
No, I agree. I think it is done. I thought we could have won the second referendum, and that's where my criticism of Labour was mostly. Just to clarify, I agree with you entirely that a referendum campaign that was run by David Cameron and George Osborne was always going to be, you know, it was always going to fail, I guess, in some ways. But where we differed, I think, was on the issue of the second referendum, and there I think we could have won it. And I think if we had won the right to have a second referendum, then I think we could have made the case to stay in. And lots of the polling showed that actually the majority of people in Britain had come round to a Remain position. But we will never be able to put it to the test. So
I agree with this, but it doesn't matter. It's completely
doesn't matter now. Too late.
Where I think we agree is that what really matters is the continuing engagement of progressive Brits with the movement, the progressive movements on the continent of Europe. Britain is not out of Europe. Europe is not the EU. It's an important part of Europe, but it's not the EU. So that, you know, when people ask us, why are you still campaigning in Britain and why is DiEM still active in Britain, we say, well, because Britain is Europe and will always remain part of Europe. But look, let's move slightly beyond that. Green New Deal. Where is the Green Party of the United Kingdom focusing? Which aspects of policy now in Britain, and what kind of resonance can there be between that focus of yours in the United Kingdom? Maybe what kind of coalescence can there be with Keir Starmer's Labour Party on this? We don't know exactly what his position is going to be, whether he will adopt the Green New Deal of the Corbynista party. And, you know, the kind of collaboration we can have across the pond with DiEM25, with the Green Movement in Europe, and so on. Well,
I think these are, as well as being nightmarish times, they're also very, very interesting times. And to the extent that political failure is quite often a failure of imagination, I think the last few months have given us the opportunity to imagine things being done in a different way. And I think far more people now are imagining that it could be possible to have a government that would take a greater role in shaping an economy rather than leaving it entirely to market forces. You know, to have a government that is now paying the wages in the UK of 6 million people, that has renationalised the railways more or less overnight, that wrote off the debt of the NHS overnight. You know, suddenly lots of things that previously seemed impossible now feel that they are possible. And so I think there is a moment here that we've got to grasp and learn the lessons of the days of the financial crisis where, you know, the anti-austerity movement didn't manage to win out. And we've got to learn what went wrong then so we can do it better now. And I think the fact that so many people from different parts of progressive movements have been talking about Green New Deal and thinking about it and planning it for a long time means that we have an opportunity potentially now to really make a strong case for building back better. I know that's a phrase that many are using, but I think it really resonates that going back to normal is not good enough because normal was intolerable for far too many people and was also trashing the environment and nature on which we depend for our survival. So it feels like there is really an opportunity here to do things differently. And you asked what element of that the Green Party in particular is focusing on. And we're looking actually right now at the steps governments are taking now. We want them to be the steps in the direction of laying the foundations for a green transformation rather than the opposite. And so right now, for example, you've got EasyJet, you've got Virgin coming cap in hand to the government saying, please bail us out. It's a little bit like the conversation we started off with around the miners and what do you do with industries that are by their nature very high carbon. And what we're saying is that public money should not be used to bail out industries in an unconditional fashion. That what we want to do is to support the workers in those industries, but not simply to get back to normal, but to have that conversation about how does aviation even begin to come in line with the Paris climate commitments? What would that mean for cancelling the expansion of Heathrow Airport, for putting away any idea of expanding Gatwick Airport, of recognising that domestic flights of course should go because we should be travelling by train, by putting the tax on aviation fuel in the UK, which we could do overnight. We don't need any international agreement to put tax on fuel inside the UK. So how do we begin to use this moment to lay the foundations for the kind of industries we're going to need in the future to tackle the climate crisis? Because there is a very real risk of jumping out of the COVID fire into the COVID frying pan into the climate fire, in the sense that if we're not careful, there are already very loud voices we know saying that we need to get back to business as usual, the economy is failing, you know, deregulate, it's faster to do it that way, and so on. And I think it's so important that right now we are also having more and more evidence. Just last week, we had the Committee on Climate Change. We had a new report by Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz, all of them saying that actually not only does it make environmental sense to invest in, for example, insulating every home in Britain, but it also makes the best economic sense, because green recovery programs tend to be far quicker to get up and running. They are, by their nature, decentralized across the country, so every constituency benefits if you're creating hundreds of thousands of jobs in, for example, programs to insulate homes and get people's fuel bills down, as well as their climate emissions. So right now, what we're focusing on, I guess, is some of those steps that the government's taking right now in terms of decisions on bailouts and so forth, that will have a really material effect on the kind of economy and society we have as we begin to emerge from COVID, at the same time as painting that bigger picture, and I hope trying to make that into a compelling, attractive picture of how the world could be. Because just to finish off, I think one of the other things that COVID has told us, or at least the response to COVID has shown us, is that actually human beings, in many ways, are far more cooperative and far more caring and compassionate than capitalism would have had us believe. You know, we've been told for decades that human beings are competitive, that we are out for ourselves, that it's all about number one. And I think one of the bits of inspiration that a lot of people have taken from the response to this crisis is just the way in which there has been just such a flourishing of mutual aid groups, of how there is so much evidence of people helping one another, that you've had people coming out onto their streets saying, I never knew who my neighbors were before, and now I do, because people almost felt that they had the excuse to go on, you know, put a note through the door next door and say, are you okay? Do you need any shopping? What can I do to help? So maybe, just maybe, there is this confluence of events, people recognizing how nice it is to have some clean air and some access to green space, people recognizing that governments can act for good if they are pushed to do so, and if there's a shared sense of urgency that requires them to do so, and that in fact human beings might just be better than we've been told, and that we might just be able to rise to the bigger challenge of climate.
At the same time, you have a government now that even before COVID-19 had distanced itself from the ideology of austerity, and the prime minister whose success depends on having stolen labor seats from, you know, the party of the opposition in key working class areas in the north of England. Is there any chance that Boris can prove smart enough to bathe himself in, you know, a green agenda and start spending some serious money on environmentally friendly investments, while at the same time, through the end of austerity, which is going to become absolutely essential now? Not only was it a decision that he had made before COVID-19, but now austerity is really just a very short route to catastrophe. We have it here in Greece, and we're going to have it in Europe because of the Austerian dynamic. But in Britain, as a opposition leader, are you not worried that maybe he's going to, you know, move away from Thatcherism? He already stated that there is such a thing as society, reflecting what you said about the importance of community, of caring about others, of moving beyond competition towards coordination and cooperation. What happens if, you know, because in the past, crises have become often the rallying call for conservatism to, you know, embrace communitarianism and even, you know, preservation of the environment and so on. Is there a chance that authoritarianism can, you know, acquire a green veneer and a sociability that entrenches its power?
Well, I can say that I'm not going to go and kind of give up politics and tend my allotment just yet. I think there's still a big fight ahead. And I think in one sense, I think what you say is interesting, because one of the things about Boris Johnson is that the only thing he cares about is power. I don't think he cares very much about any particular ideology. He's one of the least ideological prime ministers I think we've had. He just cares about keeping power. And so to that extent, if there was a strong push in the country to have, you know, more investment in cycle lanes and fewer cars, then there's a strong chance that he would do that. But he is surrounded by people who have very different agendas. And I think he also doesn't have the wit to recognize that what we're talking about here is not just some green trimmings to an economic program that is much the same as usual, but that what is required in the time frame that we have is an utter transformation of our economic system. And if it is not a transformation that also addresses inequality and social exclusion, then it is not a transformation that is even going to work. And so I think that idea of the Green New Deal, I mean, I talked about the Green New Deal very much in terms of the environmental policies, but at the heart of the Green New Deal is that sense that it has got to deliver social justice and address inequality at the very same time that it is also delivering environmental outcomes. And if it does not do that, it will not work. And I think that is something that is a million miles away from where anyone in the Conservative Party is. So I don't think anyone should be taken in by, you know, a few nice words about cycle lanes and you know, and maybe perhaps a few roads cancelled. What we need to see is a complete transformation away from the capitalist system that is driving the environmental crisis as well as failing to deliver for the vast majority of people, and all of that in an incredibly fast timescale too. And I don't see a Conservative government coming up with that.
Well, I'm very glad you said that. Of course, you know, I'm doing these programs, DiEM25, I've learned to play devil's advocate a lot more than I was used to. And I'm very glad you said that because it resonates with something you said earlier, referring to your first sojourn into environmentalism in the 1980s, that what makes a radical ecologist is the critique of capitalism, not the critique of the products of capitalism, and the need to shift power. You talked about deliberative democracy. You talked about going to you know, a Durham mining community and empowering them to come up with ideas on how to make that green transition themselves, rather than to have a top-down imposition of a Green New Deal upon them. Now, that all means a shift of power, which cannot happen unless you look very carefully at ways of transforming the very foundations of capitalism, which must be about property rights in the end. It must be about, you know, share markets, and it must be about commercial banking. Post-capitalism requires a total change in the distribution of rights over property, over wealth, not so much income flows. I think that's why we're friends, and that's why we keep working together towards a common European and transnational and global New Deal, which is not simply about shifting investments. It's about shifting power away from those who use it in a brown and antisocial way, and towards communities that must accept that responsibility, rights, and power come together. And that requires a different mode of producing and distributing stuff. Let's look at it from a global perspective. By the way, today we launched or relaunched the Progressive International with Naomi Klein, with our great comrade, the Icelandic Prime Minister Katrín Jakobsdóttir, with Noam Chomsky, with other people, fantastic environmentalists and trade unionists from Africa and from Asia. We're going to have our first teleconference on Friday. This is an invitation to you, Caroline, as well, of course. I'm sure that you will be joining us. Because, you know, unless the New Deal becomes an international one, and we learn how to juxtapose internationalism against globalization, then, you know, we can't succeed on our own.
It sounds very exciting. I look forward to hearing more about it. And I understand you're writing a book as well on not dissimilar issues around power and wealth and you know, who has a share in the future. So I look forward to all of that.
Is the Green Party working with green parties outside Europe, for instance, with ecological movements in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa? Are you connecting with these movements, or are you just so inundated with everything you need to do to keep the green agenda on the road in the United Kingdom that you just don't have the resources and time to do this?
It's a constant battle, to be honest. I mean, we're very close with the green parties within Europe, and the Global Greens is a network that does indeed have those links into all kinds of other countries outside of Europe as well. Speaking personally, I am so inundated right now just with all of my constituency work, with people whose businesses are going bust, who don't know whether they're going to have a job tomorrow, who don't know whether they're going to put food on the plate tomorrow. That right now it feels like it's more intense than ever, just in terms of that constituency side of the work that British MPs in particular have. So I haven't been involved in that, but I have colleagues who are, and I think it is massively important, going back to your point, that we demonstrate what a progressive internationalism looks like, and that is very different from a program of economic globalization, which is all about the capital rather than about the people. So I think that the Greens will want to be absolutely at the heart of that international solidarity that you're describing.
Well, we started on a personal note with the 1960s and your experiences of being introduced to literature in a friend's house and so on. Well, let's also end on a similar note. This coronavirus, lockdown, and all the devastation that you are facing amongst your constituents, and all those desperate calls for help. How's this impacting on you, on your family life, on you personally, on your character, on your psychology? Because the person is political.
That is a very big question. Like that feels like I'm on the psychiatrist's couch, and well, I have two children, and the joy of part of it, the part where I do find a bit of joy, is having one of them back home with me. The other is in the States, which feels like a very long way away. But one of them is working from home here at home. So that is very special. I feel very blessed to have a garden and access to green space. And I was struck by something I read the other day, which I think summed it up so well, where it said that we are weathering the same storm, but we are not in the same boats. And I just think that's so true, in the sense that one's experience of the last few months is so different if you are in an overcrowded flat with no green space, compared to being, somewhere where you have a bit of space and you have some access. So I know that I am very lucky. I'm also lucky in the sense that I haven't been touched personally through losing anyone through COVID, but what I feel is, from the minute I get up in the morning to the minute I go to bed at night, I am living through the experiences that are being brought to me through the constituents in Brighton who are raising, as I mentioned earlier, just such terrible situations that they're going through. I mean, people who have put everything into their own business, and yet now discover that the government's support schemes aren't fit for them and won't work for them for whatever reason. And therefore they are literally sitting, watching the disintegration of sometimes a lifetime's work, or people being, who are losing their jobs and can't begin to see how they will get another one, or people who are terrified because their family members are working with the NHS and are not getting the protection that they need to do all of that. So on the one hand, there is, it feels like I'm quite up close to lots of the anxiety and distress and anger and worry that this crisis is causing. At the same time, as I sit here in my Brighton home, and when I do get a few moments, one of the things I'm enjoying doing is listening more to the birds. We have a swift box. I'm trying to attract swifts to come and stay in our swift box in our house. So of a night you can hear, I have a tape recording of swifts to try to attract them into the box. That's apparently what you're meant to do. So I'm doing some more bird watching, some more bird listening, trying to get a bit of balance back into life.
I have a sneaking suspicion that, like the generation that went through the war, we're going to look back to the days of lockdown with a distinct sense of nostalgia, because it has given us an opportunity to rethink in a way that normality, which was always dystopic, never allowed us to. Caroline Lucas, I want to thank you on behalf of everyone who has watched us, on behalf of DiEM25, DiEM TV. This was great fun. I really enjoyed it. I hope you didn't mind it. We are going to be back next week with an Italian, half Greek, half Italian, Valeria Golino, actor. One of my favorite movies that has ever come from Italy, in Lampedusa, of all places, featured Valeria. We'll have some more fun next week. Once again, thank you deeply and profusely to Caroline Lucas. Keep struggling. Our thoughts, the thoughts of those 9 MPs of us in the Greek Parliament are with you. Your lonely struggle in the House of Commons. We're here for you, even if only mentally. And keep going. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.